right, Algebra 2, we are going to be graphing your basic sine and cosine functions. And we're only going to be dealing with the amplitude and the period today of sine and cosine curves. Later on, we're going to be shifting them around, doing translations. So first of all, let's take a look at an equation. Now, the amplitude is always the number in front of the sine or cosine. What's the amplitude? The amplitude is how far above the middle line this goes, okay? So this goes up 3, so the amplitude would be 3. The period number tells you how many curves can fit. The normal amount of curves is one curve in 2 pi radians. But sometimes it's a skinnier graph and you can fit more. Like if you have a 2 in front of here, the parenthesis, if you have 2 in front of the x, then that means you can fit 2 curves in 2 pi. So if you can fit 2 curves in 2 pi, then 2 pi divided by 2 means that your period would be pi, because 2 pi divided by 2 is just pi. And if it was 3, it would be 2 pi divided by 3, or 2 pi over 3 would be your period. So your period is the number of radians in one full curve. What do I mean by one full curve? Well, you measure from the same point to the same point. So see, crossing the x-axis up, back to where it's crossing the x-axis up. Where it peaks to where it peaks. Anywhere it completes one whole curve, whatever is easier to measure, that's where you can take your period from. These two things are things we're going to be learning later, so I'm not going to talk about them right now, but these are shifting, when you shift it left and right or up and down. So let's look at number 16. Number 16 asks you what's the amplitude and period, and then graph it. So the amplitude is the number in front of the sine or cosine. So the amplitude is 1/2. It's the absolute value. Never put the, if it's a negative, that means something different. Just use the absolute value. And the period, well, there's a 1 in front of there. So 2 pi divided by 1 is 2 pi. So if I was to graph this, I probably should have, make our x and our y, and it is a cosine curve, and I wrote over here, cosine curves peak at 0. So they go like this, they peak at 0, and that's a positive cosine curve. A positive sine curve crosses up at 0. So since it's a cosine curve, we're going to draw it peaking at 0, and then when we draw a whole curve, it goes back up at 2 pi. And this, our amplitude, is 1/2, so it would be negative 1/2 there. I am happy with that, as long as you give me one period's worth, 0 to 2 pi, showing that it goes from there to there, one whole curve, and the amplitude label the height, top, and the bottom. I'm happy with that graph. All right, let's take a look at number 24. Number 24 says state the amplitude and period and then graph one cycle. So look at this. What is the amplitude? The number in front of cosine. So the amplitude of this is 1/4. The period, there's a 2 in front of the x, so the period number is 2. So 2 pi divided by 2 is pi. So I'm going to draw this again. It's a cosine curve, so I'm going to start up here and draw one full curve, and I'm going to end it at pi, because one full curve goes to pi. And then I'm going to label the amplitude 1/4 and negative 1/4. Like I said, that is good enough for this right now, okay? Number 20. Number 20 wants you to write the function. Well, look at this. If I was to, you look at the one in your book and it shows, but it is crossing up. See, it's crossing up. So if you look up there, it crosses up at 0, so it is a sine curve. So now let's look at the amplitude. The amplitude is 3, so that goes in front of there. So y equals 3. Now if you look, one full curve, well 2 pi only does half a curve. So only half a curve fits in there. So if a full curve would go all the way there and only half a curve goes there, then it's going to be 1/2 x. How could you find that numerically? Well, one full curve here, if this is half of its 2 pi, this is going to have to be 4 pi. So if we look at this, the period, which is 4 pi, equals 2 pi over the period number, okay? The period number, I'll call it Pn. Cross multiply, Pn times 4 pi equals 2 pi. And then you divide it, Pn equals 2 pi over 4 pi. Cancel the pi's and reduce it, it comes out to 1/2. So see, you can do it mathematically as well. Just figure out what one complete curve is, which is 4 pi, and plug it into that number. The period is 4 pi equals 2 pi over the period number, which is what you put in there. And that's how much of a curve fits in 2 pi. If you see some of the curves crossing down, that's a negative sine curve. So if it's asking you to identify whether it's a sine or cosine curve, most of these are just asking for period and amplitude, so you don't have to worry about that. I don't think you're graphing negatives and positives yet. So if you see one that's crossing down or crossing up, that's a sine curve. If you see one that's peaking or valleying, that's a cosine curve, okay? But finding the amplitude is exactly the same for both. You just find the top of the curve to the middle. Finding the period is the same for both. Just trace out one full curve and see how many radians is in one full curve.